Welcome to the Franciscan Spirituality Center in La Crosse, Wisconsin's What is Spirituality podcast. Your host, Steve Spilde, is the Associate Director at the Center. His guests talk about their evolving understanding of God, prayer, healing, and wholeness.
Today, I am pleased to introduce Peter Watkins, a spiritual director and retreat leader from the Twin Cities. Peter has been a teacher of religion and theology at the high school, college, and graduate levels. On February 18th and 19th, we will be honored to welcome him at the Franciscan Spirituality Center when he presents a retreat called When Bad Things Happen, the Book of Job for Troubled Times. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
So when you come in February to talk about Job, let's figure out today, first of all, what the book of Job is. Kind of my understanding at a basic level, or at least this is the understanding for many people who know about the Bible. Job was this character in the Old Testament, and at the beginning of the story, Job is very rich.
Yep.
And then he loses all of his wealth and his family to a terrible tragedy.
Yes.
And then for a long time, he didn't complain or curse God. And then the end of the story, because he didn't curse God, he gets all his wealth and his family back. At least that's the understanding that a lot of people have.
Yep.
Which I think is at best is a really oversimplification, and at worst is really a twisting of the story and missing the most important points.
Yeah.
So tell us about the book of Job from your understanding.
You know, your explanation, your kind of synopsis there was kind of the original story. It was a oral tradition. It was kind of a folktale, and it was bad things happened to him. Job remained faithful. Therefore, God rewarded him. And it was kind of a superficial story that was taught, make sure you remain faithful to God, even in the midst of suffering, which is fine, except a wise rabbi or a group of them took that story and just like sliced it in half. And what they did was, it's kind of a sandwich story. So you have the old folktale on either side, but in the middle, you have this really amazing, poetic, very deep theology, this dialogue, this conversation among Job and his three friends. And that's really where so much of this story happens.
Your sense, how old is the book of Job that we find in the Bible? We're talking like 3,000 years old?
I don't know. It's part of wisdom literature. And we do know that the author had some understanding of the book of Isaiah, probably studied some Egyptian mythology. He knew the prophets. He was just brilliant, this author. So I can't remember the dates offhand, but certainly it was a later book that was written.
So at the very least, we're talking wisdom that's 2,000, 2,500.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe, 3,000 years old. And yet, even now at this time, there is wisdom there that even now we struggle to comprehend.
I think so. It's sublime and really very profound. And I think very timely for what's happening today. You know, the problem of suffering and why is this happening and where is God in this? I mean, that's just the human condition. This is something that we all wrestle with.
For people who are not real familiar with the book of Job, it kind of starts with this bizarre conversation between Satan and God.
It is a kind of a mix of genres because you do have that kind of folk tale, and then you have this other edition, which is this kind of heavenly scene.
Yeah.
The book starts, though, with the character of Job, and Job is just this kind of larger than life person.
Yep.
He's sort of over the top. Job is kind of the extreme. He's sort of the ideal. He's sort of what everyone wished they could be. He's got everything. He's got wisdom. He's got wealth, respect. He's got a great family. He's got, everybody loves this guy, and he's humble. He's kind of like, he's sort of equal to like the patriarchs like Jacob and Moses, and the thing that's so funny is that even God is like enamored with him. He's got everything. Even God is up there and he's just going on about, have you seen my servant Job? This guy is just amazing. I love this guy, right? And then that's when the character, he's got the heavenly host around him. So all these angels are up there. And I imagine him kind of God the Father, very masculine image here, sort of kingly God and bragging about Job. And then one of the angels, and it's interesting because they don't really translate the Hebrew. The Hebrew is ha-satan, which is how we get the word Satan. But it literally means the adversary, or the one who kind of plays the devil's advocate, I suppose. Yeah. Just the one who's kind of going to go against. And so there he is. And it's interesting. You have to kind of ask, like, well, what's going on here? Basically, he comes up and he says, look, the only reason that Job worships you is because he's rich. Take away his fortune, take away all his comforts, and he's just like the rest of them, and he's going to curse you. It's sort of funny. It's because I always think of Milton and then the fall of the angel and that sort of thing. But here, he's not lurking in hell. Satan is actually right with them, which makes you kind of think about keep your friends close, but your enemies closer sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And he's right there. At one point, he's like, well, wait a minute, where have you been? And he says, oh, I've been roaming the earth back and forth. And you just know that the guy's been up to no good. I think the problem is that God actually starts talking with him. And they say there's kind of a rule, don't ever discuss anything with the devil. Don't ever get in an argument. The old boy is going to clean your clock. You are going to lose. So it's not clear when God and Satan start talking, who's got the upper hand? Is God just naive about Job's purity and goodness? Is Satan right? God almost seems sort of naive, kind of like Eve sort of handing over the fruit, kind of thing. And that's what he does. He hands Job over to him. He's like, okay, don't touch him, but you can have your way with Job. And so the story goes then that immediately all these bad things happen to him. He loses his house, his cattle, his children, and it's bad. And then the scene goes back to heaven again. And God is bragging about Job because Job still hasn't bared or cursed him. And Satan, they have another round. And he hands Job over to Satan again. So this is very intentional by God. It wasn't just sort of a whim. It happens again. And he says, just don't kill him. And so that's when Job gets this terrible disease. He's got boils all over his skin. And then we find him in the ash heap, but it's sort of like the garbage dump. And he's out there on the outskirts of everything. And he's just sitting with the garbage, scraping these boils off of his skin. I mean, it's just like this great person, all of a sudden in the very worst place a person could be.
And then the book shifts, and it's obvious now this is a different author. Reading the book, I see it almost like a movie, like The Wizard of Oz. The beginning of The Wizard of Oz is in black and white, and then she enters Oz, and now it's in color. And then the end of the movie, it's back to black and white. The book of Job is like that. You've got this kind of, it feels almost like a cartoon, like this kind of fantasy cartoon. And then all of a sudden, the movie comes out now it's actual actors, it's color, and he's sitting on the ash heap and he's in just complete misery.
Yep.
And then there's this long period of dialogue that's almost like Shakespeare or something, where they're having these deep kind of philosophical arguments. But up until this point, even though it feels very fantastical, on the other hand, that's the way it is for us sometimes. We're kind of cruising along. We kind of feel like we've got life by the tail. And then one thing happens after another. I mean, you're afraid to ask, could it get any worse? Because it does.
Don't ask that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, this kind of over the top story, that idea that they're on the garbage dump, kind of away from the city, from his town. I mean, it is kind of this liminal place. It's this marginalized Alice in Wonderland kind of place, right? Where this really insane kind of dialogue, insane may not be the best word, but extraordinary kind of thing. And yet it's very universal, and it brings us very deep into the mystery of suffering. And what is this all about?
So Job's sitting there, he's on the edge of town, sitting out by the garbage dump, itching these boils. Yeah. And then what happens?
Well, he has some friends come by. Well, actually, there's also a very brief scene with his wife. His 7 children die. And that number 7 is always symbolic, right? It's interesting because you don't hear a lot from Job. He's just sort of stayed, there isn't this outcry, but his wife outcries and just like despair and just this terrible grief. she's kind of the only, it's a very sort of masculine story in many ways, but you do have her in there. And she gives, I think, in some ways, just this honesty and this emotive outcry that is very human.
And she says, curse God and die, right?
Yeah, just like, I mean, it's just from her soul, you know? And he is just kind of very, I don't know.
Stoic.
At this point, yeah, that's the good word. That's a good word for it. Stoic. He's very stoic, and she is not.
He would be a good Northern European. You know, that's kind of the philosophy that I was raised with. If you face struggle, don't complain about it. Other people have it worse. But part of the drama of Job's story is literally no one had it worse.
Yeah, no one has it worse than this guy. I mean, the stoicism changes though. I mean, he's stoic in the beginning. I mean, that's the interesting thing is all of these characters, they change. He has 3 friends who come to visit him. Their names are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And each of these characters, they're very wise, but they're also very flawed. The dialogue with Job and his friends, it really just kind of sheds this bright light on humanity because it's just so brutally honest. I think, you know, at first what they do well is they sit with Job without discussing, just in silence. And it says for 7 days, which again is that symbolic number. It means fullness. The world was created in 7 days. We have 7 of his children die. I mean, so there's this kind of parallel thing going on with this numerology there. And that's really amazing that they do that. But then they start talking and they try to help him or to fix what's wrong with Job. Of course, there's something wrong with him that has to be fixed. That's the assumption, right? I kind of am empathetic with his friends because if you've ever really been with someone who's deeply suffering and in a lot of pain, it's really hard to be with them. It can be really frightening. And so oftentimes we will shield ourselves from the pain and we'll just try and make sense of it. Like, for example, I heard someone say, my coworker died of lung cancer. And then another person said, well, was she a smoker? Oh, she was a smoker. And they're like, oh, good. Well, she was a smoker because I'm not a smoker, right? In other words, it's a way of, by making sense of things, sometimes what we're really doing is trying to push it away. And I think in some ways, that's what happens with Job's friends.
Yeah, because inevitably that making sense leads to judgment. I want to understand why this suffering is happening to you, but it's not for your sake, it's for my sake. So I can say, okay, that's why I'm different from you. That's why it happened to you and why it won't happen to me.
And they all at one point chime in and said, you must have sinned. You must have done something wrong. And Job continues to claim his innocence. And it's interesting. I mean, if you notice what's at stake for them is really the very whole foundation, whether they really understand that that's the foundation or not, but the whole foundation of what they believe to be their faith, you know, which is everything makes sense. Everything happens for a reason. There's a reason why you are suffering, and it must be this and this and this. And in some ways, what they're doing too is they're kind of resisting the journey of Job. Job is kind of every man, every person. And we're all called that, what the Greeks called katabasis, which is that sort of that going down into suffering and then coming back up, or what Christians call the Paschal mystery. It's that kind of death and resurrection. It's at the heart of reality. To really enter into that's the journey of Job. That was the journey of Jesus as well. Yeah. And it's not just figuring things out theologically. In some ways, we're called to let go and to, as Francis says, to die to ourselves. And we all resist it. Of course we do. That's our human nature. We want to protect ourselves. And what it's interesting too is I think that religion in some ways can really help us to do this work, but we can also use it to remain complacent and resist and even to try and shield ourselves from reality by having real quick explanations for things.
I'm a big fan of Richard Rohr, and Rohr talks a lot about first half of life spirituality and second half of life. Yeah. And I think so much of this book is really challenging that first half of life spirituality. I think maybe we're taught it, maybe it just makes sense to us, but if I do everything right, then things should work out.
Exactly.
If things don't work out, then I must have done something wrong. I mean, maybe people teach us that we don't even remember, or maybe that is just how we're wired as humans, but that's kind of the expectation, right? And that a lot of, I would say, first half of life religion really teaches that too. You know, if you want things to go well, then you need to do things right. And then we do that as a way of giving ourselves immunity from struggle. But if we live long enough and we have enough experiences, sooner or later, that's going to break down.
It does break down. And
Yes.
At one point, Job even says, calamity comes to both the blameless and the wicked. And that really shakes his concept of God. It challenges his friend's concept of God. You know, and then, so the question is what does it do to mine? I mean, if this is really true, then you can ask first half of life stuff. Well, then why should I pray? Or why should I spend any time with any of this if I don't get anything out of it? If it doesn't really protect me? I think that question is really the beginning of a major transition. It's a faith that moves me from the center of everything to suddenly God is at the center of things. That is hard to do.
Yeah.
That is very hard to do. And again, there's a real resistance there. Yeah.
Once again, referring to Rohr, he says that there are two paths to spiritual growth: deep suffering and deep love. And I always kind of modify that because I've never known anyone who got there through deep love. It was always deep suffering.
Yeah.
But where I've reframed that quote is that there are certain forms of suffering that I don't enter until I am in love. I know, like with my daughter and my wife, I've been willing to enter suffering only because I love them. Yeah. I don't want to lose them. So I will really join them in their suffering, or enter the areas of suffering in my own life that are causing problems in that relationship. Because of my love for them, okay, now I'll do my suffering work. In that regard, that's where I find the love part. It's not like I get the deep spiritual understanding because I'm so in love and had this great awakening. It's more like I still think suffering is the path to a deeper understanding of awareness. What's your reaction?
It's all mystery. And it's really not a kind of a what or a philosophy or a definition, but it's more of a, you know, as I say, it's more of a how. You know, how do I live my life? What is the process? How do I respond to suffering on a very day-to-day relational, as you said, my soul, my heart, it's right in there. And I know that it's so easy. No, the first of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism is life is difficult, life is suffering. The idea here is once we acknowledge that and name it and understand it and live into it, only then can we actually transcend it. But so many of us are taught, well, if I'm suffering, there must be something wrong with me, or there must be something that I'm not doing, or if I just try harder, or if I could just earn more respect, or if I can just do this and this. And then, or the big one is if I can just make my life more comfortable or easy, then my suffering will go away. What this book and what wise people tell us is like, no, that is just an inextricable part of life. But once we accept that, instead of running away from it or pretending that it's not there or theologizing it away or trying to fly over it, once we just accept it, then all of a sudden, really, I think our world can really open up and we have a deeper wisdom and understanding of God. And this is where Job was going and his friends were resisting. And they were using religion. Probably, and that's the interesting thing, because you read the friends and you're like, oh, that's wise. Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And then you see this flaw. So the brilliance of this book is it brings out kind of the best of religion and then the worst of religion. And it puts it all together. This is in the Bible. I mean, this is so amazing. Why don't we listen to this more and read this more? Because it could be a real help for us.
As you read it through, everything the friends say is that what normal people would agree with. Like, yep, makes sense to me. Yep, makes sense to me. And Job really comes off as this crazy guy, this heretic, even evil. Like how a good person would not say the things that he is saying.
That's right. A good person doesn't question God. Job is adamant, though. And the other thing that's great about Job is that he's always active. He's not passive. At one point, he says, toward the end, he says, I am going to search the world over. I will not stop. I will find God. I will put God on trial. I will, because there is an injustice that is done. I am outraged. This is wrong. And I'm not going to stop until I actually have it out with God. The rest of them are like, oh, I don't want to hear this. But that's his bridge to God, is that outrage, that injustice, right? For me, that's such a reminder that that's sometimes the most powerful prayer is outrage.
So he gets to that place of outrage. Like, I don't care what any of you say. I know this is wrong.
Yeah.
And God needs to stand to account.
Yeah. And it's interesting. There's a guy who comes into the scene. His name is Elihu. He shows up late and he seems to be very wise. He says, well, look, Job, with this suffering, God is communicating with you because in the end, you will know God's greater love. And you're like, oh, Elihu seems to really have the theological answer here. But again, he assumes that Job is too self-indulgent. He must be wicked. There's something wrong with Job. All of them have just a little piece of truth or wisdom, but they're all flawed in their theology, because no theology can, as brilliant as it might be, can really bring you to what actually happens to Job at the end, which is, of course, that he moves from being the theologian to being the mystic, to actually encountering God.
Describe that scene.
Sure.
Describe what happens in that scene.
Well, it's in chapter 38, and God actually comes on the scene. Job is just honest. What happens is God comes to Job in a whirlwind, which I think is just such an amazing, it's just this swirl of power, but also a kind of a randomness, this weather pattern. It's just whirling around him. And I know that at times we can say, my life feels like a whirlwind. It just feels out of control. And that's how God appears to him. Basically, what happens is he takes Job on this sort of tour of the world. You want God to be sort of nice, and you want him to sort of comfort Job. And it's like, there, I didn't really mean it. You want him to just be sort of a mother, kind of nurturing and just taking care of this poor guy, like nursing him back. There's none of that. God comes to Job. I think God gives him something better than that. He takes him on this tour of the world and he just says, look at this, see this, the incredible, awesome mystery of the world and of existence. And he says, do you know how the world came into existence? Do you know what a leaf really is? Do you know how high this mountain is? Do you know how deep the ocean is? He keeps asking him, do you know? Do you know? Look, he says, see, notice, be aware, be mindful. Look at all of this. It sort of makes me think about, there's an Ignatian sort of saying or mottos, which is God in all things. This is how we encounter God. Open your eyes and look and see, not the labels of things, but, as the Psalm says, taste and see. And I think that's what he's doing, but he's also doing it in a way of humility. At first reading, you think God is just not being very, not that Minnesota nice kind of thing. God is really challenging him. And the challenge is, get out of the way. You are not the center. I'm the center. And that is enough for Job to take this tour of the universe with God. And God is very proud of creation, especially like the big monsters like Leviathan and others. They're just like they seem to be, the appearance is just this overwhelming power, but it's actually beautiful and wonderful when you see it from a different perspective.
What's your connection to this material, or how do you understand this material in your life?
I find it very encouraging. I love theology and studied it, but what I love more these days is doing spiritual direction with folks, because I just find that that's how it's not the what, again, it's the how people live. And I find that folks, everyone is Job. We're all in this Job journey. And it really encourages me to have a learner's stance. It encourages me to continue asking the question, where are you, God? In the same way that Job did. It lets me know, encourages me to bring all of my emotions to prayer and sometimes to have it out with God. The other thing is that, again, Job is not passive, he's active and he's always taking action. And that also is a kind of a how in life. I have to believe that taking action is really where we find hope, to understand that our actions do matter. And then it also teaches me, again, the way of mysticism, an actual encounter with God. I mean, after all that Job went through, encountering God, not hearsay, as he says, not rumors, not talking about God, but actually encountering God through the world, like that's enough for him. It satisfies him. And he says, boy, I didn't know what I was talking about before. And now I see, now I get it. And as a reader, we're like, what did you get? Tell us. And then we're like, well, you kind of have to take that journey of Job that we have to take, that we have to encounter it and do it for ourselves to find out what that is.
You're coming to the Spirituality Center in February, and you're going to do an entire day or a weekend with Job?
Well, it'll be an overnight. So it'll be Friday night and then into Saturday. What I'm hoping is that we can use the story of Job as sort of a launching pad to look more deeply into our own lives.
If you have any questions about any of the programs that they offer at the Franciscan Spirituality Center in La Crosse, Wisconsin, we invite you to call us at 608-791-5295. That's 608-791-5295. You can also visit our website at www.fscenter.org. www.fscenter.org. Thank you for listening.